In this third section, we will discuss the relationship between fascism and modernity. Was fascism modern or traditional? Was it a step on Italy's path to modernity? Or was it rather a setback in the process of modernization? On the 3rd of January 1925, when the fascists had been in power for less than 3 years, Italy became a dictatorship, or one-party state. Within a few years, the fascists dismantled Italy's democratic institutions. They dissolved all political parties, apart from the Fascist Party. They introduced censorship. They reintroduced the death penalty. They restricted the freedom of the press. They also assassinated, imprisoned, or forced into exile most anti-fascists. These measures were a step back from the Enlightenment. They represented a reaction against the Enlightenment ideals of freedom, human dignity, democracy, and citizenship. Fascism started out in 1919 as a radical or revolutionary movement with a new vision for the future. The regime maintained this progressive rhetoric throughout its 20 years in power. But to hold on to power, Mussolini needed to reach a compromise with the existing forces or the traditional elites. So, within a few years of taking power, fascism renounced its radical ideas and became more conservative. The fascist leadership was made up of an alliance between reactionaries and revolutionaries. In other words, the party was made up of some revolutionaries who joined because they wanted Italy to change, and other reactionaries who joined so Italy would never change. In part, the key to fascism's success was this ability to appeal to both radicals and conservatives. In essence, fascism was a far-right, ultranationalist, and anti-socialist movement. And these elements could appeal to both radicals and conservatives. In fact, fascism lacked a clear program or ideology. What's more, its ideology evolved over the course of 20 years. It's not easy to say exactly what fascism stood for. It began as a movement that was against the status quo, against the existing institutions. But it wasn't always clear what fascism was for. It's much easier to be against something than for something, or to offer a constructive alternative. Mussolini tried to make a virtue out of this confusion by describing fascism as intuitive, spontaneous, irrational, unpredictable. Again, we see how fascism was defined in opposition to the rationality of the Enlightenment. The result was contradictory. Fascism was both modern and traditional, revolutionary and reactionary, forward-looking and backward-looking. On one hand, fascism embraced modernity and innovation, but on the other, it cleaved to Italian traditions and looked to the past. Within fascism, these contrasting elements were not reconciled, but rather coexisted. On one side, fascism was traditional, and here are 4 examples. First, fascism celebrated rural life. It encouraged the Italians to stay in the countryside and not to migrate to cities. This was connected to the Battle of the Grain. This was a campaign launched in 1925 to increase Italy's production of wheat to make the country self-sufficient. The second example is that fascism looked back to ancient Rome. The Roman Empire represented Italy's glorious past as a strong nation. Roman antiquity was adopted by fascism as a model or exemplar. The fascists borrowed Roman symbolism and vocabulary. The fascist symbol, which is a bundle of rods with an axe, was Roman. The fascist salute was Roman. The regime excavated ancient Roman ruins. It also built classical buildings imitating ancient Roman architecture. A third example is that fascism endorsed the traditional family. The regime gave money to encourage people to marry and have children. It imposed a tax to punish unmarried men. The fascist family was a traditional family, hardworking, patriotic, church-going, with fixed roles for men and women. On the fourth point, the fascist campaign for the traditional family was supported by the Catholic Church. Italy was a Catholic country and the Vatican exercised considerable influence. In 1929, the Vatican authorities and the fascist authorities signed an alliance. This was called the Lateran Pax, and they ended more than 50 years of hostility on the part of the Pope towards the Italian state. This was not an easy alliance, as the fascists and the church were rivals who were competing for control over the hearts and minds of the Italians. It was more of a marriage of convenience or a mutually profitable relationship. The fascists and the clergy shared common enemies: materialism, individualism, liberalism, and socialism. In other words, they shared an opposition to the secular values of the Enlightenment. But the fascist regime and the church tried to use each other to gain support from the Italian people and to increase their own power. On the other side, fascism was also modern. Mussolini said that the main task of the regime was to create a new Italian with new values and new ways of behaving. This new message was disseminated through the mass media, such as radio and cinema. In that sense, fascism incorporated and extended elements of futurism. The futurist movement was founded in 1909 when the writer Filippo Tommaso Marinetti published the Futurist Manifesto in the French newspaper Le Figaro. According to Marinetti, futurism was founded as a direct result of a car crash when, in 1908, attempting to avoid two cyclists, he swerved off the road and fell head over heels into a ditch. Whatever the truth about this story, it shows that futurism was a violent reaction against tradition, which sought to embrace modernity. From futurism, fascism inherited an interest in modernity, particularly a love of technology, especially cars and aeroplanes, a fondness for speed and movement, and perhaps most importantly, the idealization of war. In their manifesto of 1909, the futurists affirmed, "We want to glorify war, the only cure for the world." The fascists described war as the only cure for the world, or the only way to rid the world of the old and to bring in the new. They saw war as a way to destroy tradition and usher in modernity. War was seen as dynamic, technological, young, a force that could regenerate Italy. To summarize, fascism was a return to the past in terms of its values and its laws, but it was also a new form of mass politics. Although the regime's policies were often reactionary, its propaganda was new and revolutionary.